The sound of a door slamming echoed through the grand hallway of the Halderson mansion. In the center of a luxurious living room, a young boy, barely 15, sat slouched on a velvet sofa, his expression one of frustration. Ethan Halderson, the billionaire's son, stared down at his failed math test, the red marks on the paper almost mocking him. His father, a successful business mogul known for his strict nature, paced back and forth, his anger palpable. "You failed again, Ethan," he thundered, his voice echoing off the marble walls. Ethan tried to shrink into the sofa, wishing the floor would swallow him up. Every test, every attempt at schoolwork seemed to end in disaster. His father's disappointment was a constant weight on his shoulders. Ethan had always struggled in school, but math was his Achilles heel. No matter how hard he tried, the numbers never made sense. The other kids in his class breezed through the lessons, but Ethan was left behind, a failure in the eyes of his father. "I don't understand why you can't get this right," his father continued, his voice cold and filled with frustration. "You have everything at your disposal, Ethan. A private tutor, the best schools, and yet you keep failing." Ethan didn't respond. What was there to say? His father's words were true, and it only made him feel worse. The pressure to succeed was overwhelming. His mind drifted back to his previous attempts at studying. He had spent hours on those math problems, yet the more he tried, the worse it seemed to get. The numbers danced in front of him, mocking him with their complexity. There was nothing he could do to make them stick. "You're wasting your potential," his father spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "A Halderson doesn't fail." The words stung, but Ethan had heard them so many times before. They had become part of the background noise of his life, something he tried to ignore but never could. That was when the door opened, and Maya stepped into the room. Maya, the new maid who had recently been hired, stood quietly in the doorway, a faint look of surprise on her face. She had only been working in the mansion for a few days, and her role was simple: cleaning, organizing, and taking care of small tasks. But what no one knew about Maya was that she was sharp, very sharp. In fact, she had a secret. Maya had a degree in mathematics. Back in her hometown, she had tutored students who struggled with the subject. Maya had always been fascinated by numbers and equations. She had seen the frustration in Ethan's eyes, and for some reason, it stirred something inside her. Ethan looked up, startled by her presence. She had never entered the room while his father was around, and he felt uncomfortable, as though his private failure was being exposed. "Excuse me, Mr. Halderson," Maya said softly, her voice calm but steady. "I couldn't help but overhear. I believe I could help Ethan with his math." His father turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Help him?" He scoffed, disbelief evident on his face. "What do you know about math?" Maya stood tall, not intimidated by his scorn. "I have a degree in mathematics, sir," she said quietly, but firmly. "I tutored students back home. I could try to help Ethan." Ethan's father hesitated for a moment, then let out a dismissive laugh. "You? Help my son?" He looked at Maya, his gaze full of condescension. "You're just a maid. What could you possibly offer him?" Maya didn't flinch. "I understand that you might not trust me, sir, but I promise you, I can help him." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the tension in the room seemed to break. His father stared at Maya for a long time, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and begrudging. "Fine, but if this doesn't work, don't think for a second that I'll let you off the hook." Maya nodded, unfazed by his threat. "Thank you, sir," she said. As she walked toward Ethan, she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't want help. He didn't want to feel like a failure in front of someone new, but Maya could see past his resistance. She knew the struggle of being underestimated, and she wasn't about to let Ethan be swallowed by it. "It's okay, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but full of encouragement. "I'll be patient. Together, we can figure this out." Ethan didn't respond at first. He just stared at the paper in his hands, the numbers that had once seemed impossible to understand. But something in Maya's calm, confident presence gave him a glimmer of hope, a small spark that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond saving. For the first time in a long while, Ethan allowed himself to believe that he could succeed. It's been a week since Maya first offered to help Ethan with his math. and the tension in the mansion had noticeably shifted. The once heavy atmosphere in the house was now tinged with a strange sense of quiet hope. Maya had started working with Ethan every afternoon after school, and despite his initial reluctance, something had begun to change. Maya was patient, calm, and kind, never once showing the frustration that Ethan had grown so accustomed to seeing from his father. At first, Ethan was skeptical. He wasn't sure what a maid could teach him that all the private tutors hadn't already failed to explain. But Maya's approach was different. She didn't speak to him like he was stupid. She didn't make him feel small for not understanding. Instead, she asked him questions. She asked him to explain what he did understand, and guided him gently through the steps he was missing. It wasn't long before Ethan started feeling like he could actually get it. Maya's explanations made sense. They were clear, methodical, and at a pace that didn't make him feel rushed. Unlike the tutors who would get frustrated when he didn't understand quickly enough, Maya took her time with each problem, making sure he understood each concept before moving on. She used everyday examples to make complex equations feel relatable. "Think of it this way," she would say. "You're building something. Math is just like stacking blocks. You have to start with the bottom row before you can reach the top." Slowly but surely, the impossible became a little more possible. Ethan began to look forward to their sessions, even when he didn't want to admit it. Maya had this way of making math feel like a puzzle rather than a chore. And with each lesson, Ethan found himself getting better, little by little. At the end of their first week together, Ethan came home from school with a test result that was better than any he'd ever received. It wasn't perfect, but it was a passing grade, something that had seemed out of reach not long ago. He barely recognized the sense of accomplishment he felt as he stared at the test paper. For the first time in months, Ethan felt proud of himself. He didn't know how to react when he saw Maya later that afternoon. She was cleaning the kitchen when he walked in, and he couldn't help but smile. "Maya," he said, his voice a little uncertain but full of gratitude. "I got a B- on the math test. I couldn't have done it without you." Maya looked up, her face breaking into a smile that made her eyes sparkle. "That's great, Ethan," she said, her voice full of warmth. "I knew you could do it." Ethan felt a surge of pride, but also an odd sense of guilt. He wasn't used to feeling good about his grades. It was always his father's expectations that weighed him down. But this time, he wasn't doing it for his father. He was doing it for himself. He could feel the shift in his own mind, a change he had never expected. Over the next few weeks, Ethan continued to improve in math. The more he worked with Maya, the more his confidence grew. He was no longer afraid of failing. Maya's belief in him gave him the strength to believe in himself. Meanwhile, his father remained oblivious to the change happening right under his nose. Ethan's progress was subtle, but significant. It wasn't until the day of the next big test that everything came to a head. Ethan had been studying with Maya every afternoon, and his confidence was higher than it had ever been. But when his father found out that Ethan had been working with the maid, he was furious. "What do you mean? You've been learning math from her?" his father demanded. "She's just a maid, Ethan. What does she know about education?" Ethan felt his stomach drop. He had feared this moment, knowing that his father would never approve of Maya, no matter how much progress he had made. "She's actually really good at math, Dad," Ethan said quietly, trying to defend her. "She taught me how to understand it." His father scoffed, disbelief written all over his face. "You're supposed to be learning from the best, Ethan. From professionals, not some housekeeper." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I'm doing better because of her," he said. "I don't care what you think." For the first time, Ethan felt something shift inside him. He wasn't afraid to stand up for what he believed in. He wasn't going to let his father's narrow-mindedness define him. But his father wasn't done. "You're just a child," his father snapped, his voice filled with contempt. "You don't understand what it takes to succeed." Ethan looked at his father, his heart pounding. He had always tried to meet his father's impossible standards, but he had never felt truly seen. "Not until now." "Maybe I do," Ethan said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "Maybe I don't need your approval to be successful. I'm doing this for me, not for you." His father's face twisted in disbelief, and for a moment, Ethan thought he might see a flicker of regret in his eyes. but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a cold, hard mask. "We'll see about that," his father muttered before turning and walking away. Ethan stood there, breathing heavily. His heart was still racing, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he had control over his own future. Maya had given him something that no one else ever had: the belief in himself. And no matter what his father said, that belief was something no one could ever take away. It had been a few weeks since Ethan had stood up to his father, and the tension in the Halderson mansion was palpable. Ethan's newfound confidence in math had been growing, but so had his inner conflict. While he was improving academically, the chasm between him and his father had only widened. Every conversation with his father felt like a battle. His father, still fixated on status and prestige, couldn't see past his own narrow worldview. Ethan, on the other hand, felt like he was finally breaking free from the expectations that had shackled him for so long. But the more he worked with Maya, the more his world seemed to shift. One evening, after a particularly difficult lesson in geometry, Maya sat with Ethan in the quiet of the library. It was the first time he'd seen her without the usual smile of encouragement. She looked different, almost distant. Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Maya, what's wrong?" he asked softly, afraid that he might have said something to upset her. Maya looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mix of emotions. "It's nothing, really," she replied, her voice steady but faintly strained. She paused, as if weighing her words. "I've been thinking about your father." Ethan froze. His father had been a constant source of frustration in their lessons. Despite Ethan's improvement, his father had continued to belittle Maya's role in his education. Maya had always brushed it off, but Ethan could tell it was starting to wear on her. "What about him?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice neutral, though he could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I know how much you want to please him," Maya began, her voice soft, "but you can't keep sacrificing your own happiness for someone who doesn't see you for who you truly are." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had been trying so hard to live up to his father's impossible standards that he hadn't realized how much it had taken out of him. Maya's words hit him like a wave, washing away the last of the guilt he had carried for so long. "I don't know what to do, Maya," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried everything to make him proud, but it's never enough. I don't know who I am anymore, apart from what he wants me to be." Maya leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand on his. "You are Ethan Halderson," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "You don't need to be anyone else to be worthy. The person you are is more than enough." Ethan looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen, not as the son of a billionaire or the student of a prestigious school, but simply as Ethan, the boy who was trying to find his way in a world that had always been too demanding. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. Ethan found himself becoming more assertive in his studies, no longer letting the fear of failure control him. But the biggest shift came when Ethan's father called him into his office. It was a typical grandiose room, filled with polished furniture and shelves lined with books he would never read. Ethan entered, his stomach in knots. His father was seated behind his large desk, a scowl on his face. "Sit down, Ethan," his father said, his voice cold. Ethan sat in the chair opposite him, trying to keep his composure. "I've been thinking about what happened," his father continued, his tone icy. "About you working with the maid." Ethan bristled at the word maid, but he kept his expression neutral. "She's not just a maid, Dad," he said firmly. "She's helped me understand things I could never have grasped before." His father's eyes narrowed. "Do you really think you're going to amount to something just because you have a passing grade in math? That's not the way the world works, Ethan. You need to have more than that to succeed." Ethan could feel the frustration building inside him. "I don't want to live my life based on your rules, Dad," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "I don't want to be just another businessman in a suit. I want to do something that matters, something I'm passionate about." His father scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Passionate? You'll find out soon enough that passion doesn't pay the bills." Ethan stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He had had enough of his father's cold, calculating world. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice trembling. "Maybe passion doesn't pay the bills, but I'd rather live a life I love than one built on expectations I never wanted. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt a rush of liberation. He wasn't the scared little boy he had once been, hiding behind his father's success. He was his own person, and he was ready to fight for what he believed in. As he walked out of the office, Ethan felt like he was stepping into a new chapter of his life. Maya had given him the courage to be himself, and no matter what his father thought, he knew he was on the right path. It had been days since Ethan had stood up to his father, but his resolve was only growing stronger. He felt the weight of the mansion around him, a place that had always symbolized power, success, and his father's expectations. Now, those walls seemed to close in on him. Ethan had begun to distance himself, not just physically, but emotionally, from the life his father had planned for him. His father's cold disapproval was hard to ignore, but it no longer held the same power over him. The more he worked with Maya, the more he realized that he didn't want to follow the path his father had set. He wanted to forge his own. It was an afternoon like any other when Ethan found himself sitting in the quiet of the study, a place that had once been a refuge for his father's work and now felt like a prison. Ethan was poring over his math problems again, his hand absently tapping the edge of the desk. The numbers didn't seem as confusing anymore. Thanks to Maya's steady guidance, he had gained a new understanding of the subject. But it wasn't just math that had changed for Ethan. It was his whole perspective on life. The past few weeks had been eye-opening, to say the least. Maya's influence had opened his eyes to what really mattered. The more he spent time with her, the more he realized how much he had been missing out on. Maya didn't just teach him math. She taught him something far more valuable, the importance of self-worth. She didn't care about his family's wealth, his last name, or the pressure he felt to be perfect. She treated him as an equal, not the son of a billionaire. For once in his life, Ethan felt truly seen. Maya had become more than just a tutor. She had become someone he could talk to, someone who understood him. As he sat in the study, Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He looked up, surprised to see Maya standing there, her expression serious. "Ethan," she said softly, "I need to talk to you." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen her so serious before. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Maya stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "It's about your father," she began. Ethan's stomach dropped. "What about him?" he asked, dreading what she might say. "I don't know how to say this, but I think your father is starting to notice the changes in you," Maya said, her voice cautious. "He's not happy about it, Ethan. He's been asking around, trying to figure out why you're suddenly doing so much better in math." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "What do you mean? Why does it matter to him?" Maya paused before speaking again. "Because he's not the type of person who likes to lose control. He sees you as his legacy, and he doesn't like the idea of you making decisions on your own. He wants you to stay on the path he's set for you, but you're not following it anymore." Ethan felt a surge of anger rise in him. "So what? Is he going to fire you? Because if he does, I'll—" "No," Maya interrupted, shaking her head. "I'm not worried about that, but I am worried about you, Ethan. You've been growing so much lately, and I don't want to see you lose that. I don't want to see you give in to the pressure again." Ethan stood up, his hands clenched into fists. "I'm not going to let him control me anymore, Maya," he said firmly. "I don't care what he thinks. I'm done trying to live up to his expectations." Maya's face softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," she said quietly. "You're stronger than you think." The words hit Ethan like a wave. He had never thought of himself as strong, not in the way Maya saw him. To him, strength had always been about achieving success, meeting expectations, and never showing weakness. But now, with Maya's encouragement, he realized that true strength wasn't about what his father wanted from him. It was about standing up for himself, no matter the cost. The next morning, Ethan made a decision that would change everything. He walked into his father's office with a sense of determination that he had never felt before. His father was sitting behind his desk, as always, but there was something different in the air. Ethan didn't wait for his father to speak. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steady. His father raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the change in Ethan's demeanor. "What is it, son?" he asked, his tone cold but curious. Ethan took a deep breath. I'm not going to live my life the way you want me to anymore, he said, his words clear and firm. I know you've always wanted me to follow in your footsteps, but I don't want that. I want to make my own choices, and I want to be happy. His father's face twisted in anger, but Ethan didn't flinch. You're making a mistake, Ethan, his father snapped. You'll regret this. No, Ethan replied, shaking his head. I'm not going to regret being myself. And with that, Ethan turned and walked out of the office, leaving his father behind in the cold silence of his own world. As he walked down the hallway, Ethan felt a sense of freedom he had never experienced before. He was no longer bound by his father's expectations. He was finally free to be the person he was meant to be. It had been a week since Ethan had spoken to his father, and the tension in the Halderson mansion was at its peak. Ethan felt a sense of freedom after his confrontation with his father, but that freedom came with its own set of challenges. He had made his choice, and now he was living with the consequences. His father had been distant, and the house was eerily quiet. But Maya's presence in his life remained a constant, a steady source of support and encouragement. They continued their lessons, and Ethan's progress in math had skyrocketed. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was finally mastering something on his own terms. Every day, Maya helped him see not just the equations, but the possibilities that life held. They spent hours together after school, discussing everything from math to the bigger questions about life. Maya had become more than just a tutor to him. She had become a friend, someone who believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. But as the days passed, Ethan started to feel the weight of the growing distance between him and his father. Despite his resolve, the quiet judgment in his father's eyes lingered. Ethan knew his father didn't approve of his choices, but it was the constant, unspoken pressure that was harder to bear. His father had always been a man of power and control, and Ethan's decision to carve out his own path had shaken him to the core. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the tension reached a breaking point. Ethan's father, still cold and distant, glanced up from his plate. "Ethan," his father said, his voice uncharacteristically calm, "we need to talk." Ethan's heart sank. He had been dreading this moment, the moment when his father would confront him directly about his decision. "What is it, Dad?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. His father leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "You've made it clear that you don't want to follow the path I've set for you," his father began. "But you need to understand something, Ethan. The world doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care about your dreams. It only cares about results." Ethan's pulse quickened, but he held his ground. "I know what I want, Dad," he said firmly, "and it's not what you want for me. I want to make my own choices. I want to be something real, not just the heir to a business empire." His father's expression hardened, and the tension in the room thickened. "You think you can do this on your own?" his father asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "You think the world is just going to hand you success because you believe in yourself?" Ethan took a deep breath. "No, I don't think success is just handed to me. But I do think I can build my own future, one that isn't dictated by your expectations." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Ethan's father said nothing for a long moment, his eyes cold as he stared at his son. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and controlled. "You're making a mistake, Ethan," he said. "You're too young to understand the consequences of your choices. I've spent my whole life building this empire, and you're throwing it all away for a fantasy." Ethan felt a surge of frustration, but he didn't let it show. "It's not a fantasy, Dad. It's my life." His father's lips pressed into a tight line. "You'll regret this," he muttered, before turning his attention back to his meal. Ethan sat there, his heart pounding, as the weight of his father's words hung in the air. He knew his father didn't understand, but that didn't matter anymore. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was in control of his own future. The next day, Ethan sat in the library, his thoughts swirling. He had made his decision, but the path ahead was still unclear. The pressure from his father was immense, and he couldn't deny that a part of him still craved his approval. But deep down, he knew that he couldn't continue to live for someone else. He had to live for himself. As he sat there, Maya entered the room, her presence a calming force. She noticed the look on his face immediately and sat down beside him. "Ethan, what's going on?" she asked gently. Ethan hesitated before speaking, the weight of his father's words still heavy in his chest. "He doesn't get it, Maya," Ethan said, his voice strained. "He doesn't understand that I'm not doing this to hurt him. I just want to be myself." Maya smiled softly and placed a reassuring hand on his. "I know, Ethan, and I think you're doing the right thing. You're brave, and that takes strength." Ethan looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. Maya had been his rock through all of this. "I don't know what the future holds, Maya," he said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I know I can't go back. I've made my choice." Maya nodded. "And I'll be here to help you, no matter what." Ethan took a deep breath, his heart feeling lighter than it had in days. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally on the path he was meant to be on. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time, Ethan believed in himself. And that belief was something no one could take away. It had been a month since Ethan had made his stand, and the mansion still felt like a place of cold silence. His father had not spoken to him much since their confrontation, but the tension in the house had only grown thicker. Ethan knew his father was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake, but something in him had shifted. He was no longer the boy who had been afraid of disappointing his father. He was the young man who was learning to stand on his own, to trust his instincts, and most importantly, to trust Maya. The math lessons continued, and Ethan's confidence grew. It wasn't just about the numbers anymore. It was about finding his own voice, his own path. Maya had helped him realize that life wasn't just about following in someone else's footsteps. It was about carving your own way. And that realization had changed everything. But with each passing day, Ethan could feel the weight of his father's expectations hanging over him. The pressure to succeed, to live up to the Halderson legacy, was always there, lurking in the background. Even though his father had barely acknowledged him, Ethan knew his father was watching, waiting for him to fail. The real test was coming soon. The prestigious Ivy League university his father had been grooming him for had sent an invitation to apply. It was the path his father had always envisioned for him. A future in business, a future that would carry on the family name. It was everything Ethan had once dreamed of. But that dream no longer felt right. Maya had opened his eyes to the possibility of a different kind of future, one where he could make his own choices, follow his passions, and be his own person. Yet, the invitation still sat on his desk, a constant reminder of the life his father expected him to lead. Ethan's heart raced as he stared at the letter. He knew he had a decision to make, and this time, it wasn't just about math or grades, it was about his future. The door to his room opened, and Maya stepped in, her face thoughtful as she observed the letter on his desk. She had been quiet lately, sensing the storm brewing inside Ethan. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" she asked gently, her voice calm yet filled with understanding. Ethan didn't answer at first. He just stared at the letter, torn between the path he had always been told to follow and the one that felt like it was finally his to take. "I don't know what to do, Maya," Ethan admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've worked so hard to make my father proud, but this isn't what I want anymore. This isn't who I am." Maya walked over to his desk and sat beside him, her presence steadying him. "Ethan, you don't have to make this decision alone. You've already taken the first step by choosing your own path. The rest will come when you're ready." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what if I lose everything? What if I fail?" Maya smiled softly, a warmth in her eyes. "Failure isn't the end, Ethan. It's part of the journey. But living a life that isn't yours, living for someone else's expectations, that's the real failure." Ethan took a deep breath, her words sinking in. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't bound by his father's dreams for him. He wasn't defined by the legacy of the Halderson name. He could create his own future. But even as he felt this newfound strength, doubt crept in. His father had made it clear how he would react if Ethan refused to follow the path he had set. Ethan knew he would lose his father's approval, and with it, the security that came with being part of the Halderson empire. But was that security worth living a life of regret? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The next day, Ethan stood in front of his father's office, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His hands shook slightly as he knocked on the door. His father's voice called from inside. "Come in." Ethan stepped inside, his heart pounding. His father looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "What is it, Ethan?" he asked, his voice cold. Ethan took a deep breath. "Dad," he said, his voice steady, "I've decided not to apply to Ivy League. I've realized that I need to follow my own path. I want to study something I'm passionate about, not business. I'm not going to be who you want me to be anymore." For a moment, there was silence. His father stared at him, his face hardening, his jaw clenched. "You're making a huge mistake, Ethan," his father said, his voice filled with disdain. "You'll regret this. You'll throw away everything I've worked for." Ethan stood his ground, his eyes unwavering. "I've already made my decision, Dad," he said softly. "This is my life, and I'm going to live it on my terms." His father stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You'll regret this," he repeated, his voice colder now, more final. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be consequences. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was making the right choice. As he walked out of his father's office, Ethan felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. The future was uncertain, but it was his. And for the first time in a long while, he felt free. It had been 2 weeks since Ethan had told his father he wasn't going to follow the path that had been laid out for him. The decision weighed heavily on him, but there was a sense of clarity he hadn't felt before. He was free, or so he thought. His father, still cold and distant, hadn't spoken to him much since that day. But Ethan could feel the tension between them, thick like a cloud hanging in the mansion. The silence was deafening. He didn't expect his father to understand, but the lack of communication from his side made everything feel so final. Ethan had been working hard to build his own future, but that didn't mean the past could just be erased. Maya had been his constant support. She had become more than just a tutor. She had become a friend, and even though his world was changing, he knew he could count on her. She was the one who had shown him that there was more to life than what his father had built for him. She had given him the courage to pursue his own dreams, no matter the cost. Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the screen in front of him. His future seemed uncertain, but one thing was clear: he was no longer going to let anyone dictate his life. He had made his decision, and now he was going to follow through. He felt the weight of the world lifting off his shoulders, but at the same time, the pressure to succeed on his own felt daunting. As he clicked away on his computer, planning his next steps, he heard the familiar knock on his door. It was Maya. "Ethan, can I talk to you?" she asked softly. Ethan looked up from his desk, surprised to see her standing there. Her face was serious, and there was a look of concern in her eyes. "Of course," he said, gesturing for her to come in. Maya stepped inside, her hands clasped in front of her as she slowly walked toward the desk. "I just wanted to check in with you," she said gently. "How are you feeling? You've been so focused on your studies and planning for the future. But I can see the pressure is building." Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I'm doing okay," he said, though his voice betrayed the uncertainty he felt inside. "But it's tough. I feel like I've made this huge decision, and now I have no idea if it was the right one." Maya sat down across from him, her eyes soft with understanding. "I know it's hard," she said, "but you're not alone in this. You've come so far already, and you have everything it takes to succeed. Just remember, it's okay to feel unsure sometimes." Ethan looked at her, grateful for her words. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I'm scared that I've made the wrong choice, that I'll regret not following my father's path. He's built this empire, and now I feel like I'm throwing it all away." Maya shook her head gently. "You're not throwing anything away, Ethan. You're building something of your own, something that matters to you, and that's worth more than anything your father could give you." Ethan smiled weakly, feeling the weight of her words sink in. "I know," he said quietly. "I just need to figure out where to start. There's so much I want to do, but it feels overwhelming." Maya stood up and walked over to the window, her back turned to him. "Start small," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Take one step at a time. You don't have to have everything figured out right away. You just have to keep moving forward." Ethan looked at her, realizing how much her presence had become a steadying force in his life. She wasn't just teaching him math, she was teaching him life skills, too, the ability to move forward, even when the future seemed uncertain. "You're right," he said, standing up from his desk. "I've been so focused on the bigger picture that I've forgotten how to take it one step at a time." Maya turned to face him, a gentle smile on her face. "That's all anyone can do. You're not alone, Ethan. I'll be here to help you every step of the way." Ethan nodded, his heart feeling lighter. "Thank you, Maya," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you." She smiled warmly. "You'd do just fine, but I'm happy to be here for you." As Maya left the room, Ethan sat back down at his desk, a renewed sense of purpose flooding through him. For the first time, he realized that it didn't matter if he had all the answers right now. What mattered was that he was no longer afraid to ask the questions. He was no longer afraid to step into the unknown. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like he was in control of his own destiny. It had been a week since Ethan made his final decision to go his own way, and although the silence between him and his father had become deafening, he had never felt more alive. For the first time, Ethan was making choices based on his own desires, not the expectations of those around him. He had been working on his plans for the future, but something deep down told him that he wasn't ready to fully take the leap just yet. Every step had felt like progress, but the fear of failure lingered, especially knowing that his father was still watching, still waiting for him to make a mistake. The quiet judgment from his father was a constant weight on his shoulders. Ethan was determined not to let it define him anymore, but that didn't make it any easier to ignore. One evening, after another day of intense studying, Ethan found himself in the kitchen, staring blankly at the stove. His mind was a whirl of thoughts. He had so much potential, so many things he wanted to do, but it all felt so overwhelming at times. As he leaned against the counter, trying to collect his thoughts, Maya walked in. Her presence was always a comforting balm to his troubled mind. "How are you doing?" she asked softly, as she poured herself a cup of tea. Ethan shrugged, his shoulders tense. "I'm trying, Maya," he admitted, his voice filled with frustration. "I keep moving forward, but there's this weight that won't let me breathe. Every day, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells, like one wrong move, and everything will come crashing down." Maya sat down beside him, her calm eyes meeting his. "I know it's hard," she said gently, "but the fact that you're still standing, still moving forward, says a lot about who you are. You're stronger than you think." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Maya. I thought I had it all figured out when I made my decision. But now, it feels like I'm stuck between two worlds, my father's world and mine." Maya nodded slowly, understanding his struggle. "The hardest part is realizing that you don't need anyone's approval to live your truth," she said softly. "You don't need to justify yourself to anyone, Ethan. You've already made your decision. Now you just have to trust it." Ethan looked at her, grateful for her unwavering support. "But what if I fail?" he asked, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "What if everything I'm working for falls apart?" Maya reached out and placed a hand on his. "Failure isn't the end," she said, her voice steady and warm. "It's just another step along the way. You won't be judged by your failures, but by how you handle them." Ethan looked down at her hand on his, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. Maya's words were a lifeline, pulling him out of the depths of doubt. He had been so focused on the idea of success that he had forgotten that failure was just part of the journey. It didn't define him, and it didn't make him any less capable. "I just don't want to disappoint anyone," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "Especially my dad. I know I'm not following his plan for me, but it feels like I'm letting him down." Maya smiled softly, her expression gentle. "You're not disappointing anyone, Ethan. You're simply choosing a different path, one that's true to who you are. And trust me, that's something to be proud of." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight on his shoulders lighten just a little. He had a long road ahead of him, but he was beginning to realize that the road didn't have to be walked alone. Maya was there for him, and that made all the difference. The next day, Ethan found himself sitting at his desk, staring at the computer screen. He had spent hours thinking about the future, trying to figure out where to start. It wasn't the same as it had been before. Now, He was trying to plan a future that aligned with his own goals, not his father's. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel as terrifying. As he clicked away on his computer, drafting plans for the future, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. His father's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Ethan." Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he turned to face his father. The man's presence was still as imposing as ever, but there was something different in the air. "We need to talk," his father said, his voice cold and measured. Ethan swallowed hard, his hands clammy. This moment had been inevitable. "Sure," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. His father walked into the room, closing the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, sizing Ethan up, before speaking again. "I've been thinking," his father began, his tone distant, "and I've decided that if you want to make something of yourself, you'll need more than just a passing grade in math. You'll need discipline, focus, and a plan. I'm willing to help you, but you have to understand that you can't do this on your own." Ethan listened, his chest tightening with each word. It was the same old speech, the same expectations that had always loomed over him. But something in Ethan snapped. He wasn't that boy anymore. He wasn't going to be swayed by his father's pressure. "I don't need your help, Dad," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'm building my own future. It might not be what you want, but it's mine." His father's face twisted in anger, but Ethan didn't flinch. "You're making a huge mistake," his father spat, his voice low and dangerous. "I won't stand by and watch you ruin everything I've worked for." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. "It's not about what you've worked for, Dad. It's about what I'm willing to work for." And with that, Ethan turned his back on his father, knowing that the hardest part was over. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had taken control of his own destiny. It had been a month since Ethan made the bold decision to live his life on his own terms, and the journey had been anything but easy. The distance between him and his father remained, thickening like an impenetrable wall. Yet Ethan's resolve had only strengthened. He had faced so many doubts, his own and those of the people around him, but there was one constant he had come to rely on: his own determination. Maya, his steadfast friend and mentor, had been there every step of the way, offering encouragement when the road ahead seemed too uncertain. Despite the weight of the situation, Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. The tension in his father's house was still palpable, but Ethan had stopped looking for approval. His decision had been made, and now it was time to live with it, consequences and all. One afternoon, while working through a challenging algebraic concept Maya had introduced to him, Ethan heard the familiar sound of his father's footsteps. He had been so absorbed in his studies that he hadn't even noticed his father approaching. "Ethan," his father's voice broke the silence, making him jump slightly. "I need to speak with you." Ethan's heart sank, knowing that this conversation wasn't going to be easy. He turned to face his father, who was standing at the door, arms crossed, his eyes hard as ever. "Sure, Dad," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice calm. His father didn't waste any time. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day," he began, his tone controlled, though there was an underlying hint of frustration. "You've chosen to walk away from everything I've worked for, everything I've built, and I still don't understand why." Ethan stood up, setting his book aside. "I've already told you, Dad," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I don't want the life you've planned for me. I want to live my own life, not be a puppet to your expectations." His father's expression darkened. "You think you can do it on your own? You think you'll just waltz into the world and make something of yourself without the right connections, the right resources?" Ethan didn't flinch. "I've already made something of myself, Dad. I've found my passion. I've found the courage to live my truth. And that's more than anything your money can buy." His father's eyes narrowed, as if trying to understand this new Ethan standing before him. "You still don't get it, do you?" his father said, his voice quieter now, but full of disbelief. "This isn't about money, Ethan. This is about legacy. This is about ensuring that what I've worked for doesn't disappear. And you want to throw it all away for what? Some pipe dream?" Ethan's heart pounded. His father's words stung, but they no longer had the power to crush him. "It's not a pipe dream, Dad," he said quietly. "It's my life, and I'm going to live it the way I see fit." The silence that followed was heavy, each word hanging in the air like an unanswered question. His father stood there, staring at him with a mixture of frustration and something else, something Ethan couldn't quite place. "I can't believe you're doing this," his father muttered, his voice almost broken. "After everything I've done for you, you choose this path. Do you really think you can just ignore the world around you and be happy?" Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes unwavering. "I'm not ignoring the world, Dad. I'm choosing to live in it on my own terms. I'm choosing to be happy with who I am, not with what you want me to be." His father didn't respond immediately, his face unreadable. For a long moment, they just stood there, two men on opposite sides of a chasm that neither could bridge. Finally, his father turned away, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "I can't change your mind, can I?" he asked, his voice low. "No," Ethan replied simply, "but I can change mine." With that, his father walked out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Ethan stood in the stillness, his heart racing. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The weight of his father's disapproval still hung in the air, but it no longer defined him. Ethan had made his choice, and no matter what came next, he was going to live it. Later that evening, as Ethan sat in his room, Maya came to check on him. She could tell something had shifted in him. She knew the conversation with his father had been a difficult one. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice soft but full of concern. Ethan looked up, his face unreadable for a moment before a small, tired smile appeared. "It went exactly how I thought it would," he said quietly. "But for the first time, I don't feel like I'm losing something. I feel like I'm gaining everything." Maya smiled back at him, her eyes full of pride. "You're stronger than you know, Ethan. I'm proud of you." Ethan felt a warmth spread through him at her words. It was the kind of pride he had been waiting for all his life, and it wasn't coming from his father. It was coming from someone who truly saw him, who believed in him. And that was enough. The next morning, as Ethan woke up and stared out the window at the horizon, he realized something. The path ahead would be difficult, and there would be moments of doubt, but for the first time in his life, he knew who he was and what he wanted. And that was all that mattered. He wasn't defined by his father's empire or anyone else's expectations. He was Ethan Halderson, and he was ready to build his own future, one step at a time. It had been a few months since Ethan made his decision to carve his own path, and although the journey had not been easy, it had been transformative. His father's cold disapproval still lingered, but Ethan had grown stronger with each passing day. He no longer sought his father's validation. He had come to realize that his happiness did not lie in following a predetermined path set by someone else. The more time he spent pursuing his own goals, the more he felt like he was building something real. Ethan had started taking on small projects in the field of his choice, something he had always been passionate about but had never had the courage to pursue. Maya had been there every step of the way, offering support and encouragement, even when Ethan had doubts about his own abilities. The truth was, Ethan had never truly believed in himself, not until now, but with Maya's help, he was beginning to change that. One afternoon, after weeks of intense work and self-reflection, Ethan found himself sitting at his desk, reflecting on how far he had come. His phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Maya. "I think it's time you faced your father. You've made so much progress, and I know it's hard, but it might help put things in perspective." Ethan stared at the message for a moment, feeling a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. For months, he had been avoiding the inevitable confrontation with his father. He knew that the moment would come when he would have to stand firm and show his father that he was serious about his choices. He didn't know if his father would understand, but he knew he had to try. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stood up from his desk, determined to face whatever came next. He walked down the hallway toward his father's office, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking softly. His father's voice, as commanding as ever, called from inside, "Come in." Ethan opened the door slowly, stepping into the room where he had spent so many years trying to live up to expectations that never seemed to end. His father looked up from the papers he was reading, his eyes narrowing when he saw Ethan standing there. "What is it, Ethan?" his father asked, his tone stiff, betraying nothing but indifference. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. His father's expression didn't change, but he gestured for Ethan to sit down. "I've been waiting for this conversation," his father said, folding his arms across his chest. "I assume you're here to explain why you've chosen this ridiculous path." Ethan took a seat across from his father, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. "Dad, I'm not going to change my mind. This is who I am now. I'm not the same person I was when I made that decision. I've learned so much about myself, and I'm happier than I've ever been," his father scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Happiness? You think that matters? In the real world, Ethan, it's about success. It's about power. It's about what you can achieve." Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I get that, Dad, but the truth is, all of that success, power, and wealth never meant anything to me. Not until now. Now, I'm focused on something more meaningful. I want to build something that matters. I want to make a difference." His father's gaze hardened, his eyes cold as ice. "You're naive, Ethan. You don't understand what it takes to survive in the world. You've always had everything handed to you. You've never had to fight for anything." Ethan's heart clenched at his father's words, but he refused to back down. "You're right. I've never had to fight for anything, but that's because I've been living someone else's life. Now, I'm living mine." There was a long, tense silence as his father studied him, his jaw clenched, as if deciding whether or not to say more. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but full of finality. "You're making a huge mistake," he said. "You'll see that soon enough." Ethan stood up, feeling his resolve harden. "I don't need to see anything. I know what I'm doing. And for the first time, I'm doing it for me." His father stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. But Ethan didn't falter. He wasn't the same boy who had once cowered under his father's expectations. He was a young man who had found his own voice. With one final glance at his father, Ethan turned and walked out of the room. As he left the office, he felt a rush of freedom. He had finally faced his father, and even though the conversation hadn't gone the way he'd hoped, he knew he had made the right choice. Maya had been right. It was time to take control of his own life, and no matter what came next, he was ready. For the first time, Ethan was truly living for himself. It had been several weeks since the confrontation with his father, and Ethan was beginning to realize that the journey he had embarked on was only just beginning. He had taken control of his own future, made the hard decision to follow his own path, and stood up to the one person who had always been the voice of authority in his life. But as much as he had grown, there were still moments of doubt, moments when the weight of his decision seemed almost too heavy to bear. Yet, with every passing day, Ethan felt a sense of peace and purpose that he had never known before. The world was wide open in front of him, and for the first time, he felt like he could truly begin to shape it. Maya had been by his side through it all, offering her unwavering support and wisdom. She had been the one to encourage him when his self-doubt threatened to swallow him whole. And despite his father's ongoing disapproval, Maya had reminded him that he was not alone. One afternoon, as Ethan was sitting in the library, his laptop open in front of him, he received a phone call. It was from his father's office. He hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the answer button. He had been avoiding direct contact with his father ever since their last conversation, unsure of what else his father could possibly say. But part of him knew that the call was inevitable. Sighing deeply, he pressed the button to answer. "Ethan," his father's voice came through the phone, stiff and formal as always. "We need to talk." Ethan's heart sank. "What is it, Dad?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's time you come home," his father said bluntly. "I've been thinking. You can't keep running away from responsibility. You've made your point, but now it's time to come back and face your role." Ethan's stomach churned. He had expected this moment to come, but that didn't make it any easier. "I'm not running away from anything, Dad," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'm building my own future. I'm not going to let you control my life anymore." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ethan could hear his father's sharp intake of breath, and for a moment, he wondered if his father would lash out, as he always had in the past. But instead, his father's voice softened. I know you don't understand, Ethan, but you're my son. I've spent my whole life building this empire, and I just want you to be a part of it. You don't have to take over right now, but you need to learn how to carry the weight of this family. Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. For years, he had tried to live up to this expectation, to be the perfect heir to a fortune he never asked for. But now, he knew that he had to make his own legacy, one that was truly his. Dad, I've made my decision, Ethan said, his voice clear. I'm not going to be part of your empire. I'm going to build my own, on my own terms. I want to create something that matters, something that's real. There was another long silence. Ethan could hear his father's breath on the other end of the line, but this time, it wasn't filled with anger. Instead, there was a sense of resignation. I don't agree with you, Ethan, his father said quietly, but I can't make you do something you don't want to do. You're an adult now. I can't control you anymore. Ethan's heart sank. He had hoped for some sort of reconciliation, some small sign of approval, but it seemed that his father was simply done. And in a strange way, that was all Ethan needed to hear. He had been living in the shadow of his father's expectations for so long that hearing those words made him realize just how far he had come. Thank you, Ethan said, his voice soft but steady. I appreciate that. I hope you figure it out, son, his father replied, his voice filled with quiet uncertainty. You're a smart kid, but you've got a long road ahead of you. I know, Ethan said, and I'm ready for it. As he hung up the phone, a sense of calm washed over him. His father's disapproval no longer held any power over him. He had chosen his path, and for the first time, he was free to walk it without fear. Maya, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, came over and placed a hand on his shoulder. How did it go? She asked gently. Ethan smiled, the weight of the moment finally lifting off his shoulders. It went exactly how I thought it would, he said quietly. But I'm okay with it now. Maya's smile was soft, full of pride and understanding. You did the right thing, Ethan, she said. You've been brave, and that's something not everyone can say. Ethan nodded, a sense of peace filling him that he hadn't felt in years. Thanks for being here with me, Maya, he said, his voice full of gratitude. I don't know where I'd be without you. Maya smiled again, her eyes full of warmth. You'd be just fine, Ethan. But I'm happy to be here with you. As Ethan looked out the window, a wave of calm washed over him. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready. He wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations. He wasn't living in the shadow of his father's empire. He was Ethan, carving out his own path, and he was finally free. It had been 3 months since Ethan had finally broken free from his father's shadow. The weight of his decision had begun to feel less like a burden and more like a challenge he was eager to take on. He had chosen his own path, far from the empire his father had built, and every day brought him closer to something he had always wanted but never thought possible. He had started his own business, one that was small but meaningful, and every success, no matter how small, felt like a victory. He had done it on his own terms. Maya continued to stand by him, offering her support and advice. She had become his closest ally, and over time, Ethan had realized how much her presence meant to him. They had grown close, not just as mentor and student, but as something more friends, and perhaps something deeper. But Ethan had yet to acknowledge the feelings that had quietly been growing inside him. One evening, as they sat together in the small office Ethan had rented for his business, working late on some paperwork, Ethan finally decided to bring up the question that had been bothering him for weeks. He looked up from his desk and caught Maya's eye. Maya, he began, his voice uncertain, can I ask you something? She looked up from her work, a soft smile on her face. Of course, she said, setting her pen down and giving him her full attention. Ethan took a deep breath, his heart racing slightly. Do you ever think about the future? I mean, beyond the business and everything. Do you ever wonder if we're just, meant to go in different directions? Maya was quiet for a moment, her eyes searching his face, as if she was trying to read his thoughts. She tilted her head slightly. I think about the future all the time, Ethan, she said softly. But you're right. Life is unpredictable. Sometimes, I wonder what would happen if I just stayed here, helped you with everything, and watched you succeed. But I know you're on your own journey, and I have mine." Ethan felt a pang in his chest at her words. It was exactly what he had been thinking. He had spent so much time focused on his own growth and success that he hadn't considered how his choices were affecting the people who had been there for him. He had always leaned on Maya, and now he realized that her support was something he couldn't take for granted. "Maya," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, I don't want you to just be a part of my journey. I want you to be a part of my life. I know this might sound crazy, but I don't want to let you go." Maya's eyes widened slightly, and Ethan could see a flash of something in her eyes, surprise, maybe, or uncertainty. She didn't say anything right away, and the silence stretched between them. Ethan held his breath, waiting for her response. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but filled with warmth. "Ethan," she said, standing up and walking over to him, "I don't think you're crazy. But I've always known that you're more than capable of making your dreams come true on your own. You don't need me to do that, but I do want to be here for you, always." Ethan stood up as well, moving closer to her. "I know that, but I guess I've just realized that. You're more important to me than anything else, more than just the business, more than just the success. You've always been there, and I want to be there for you too." Maya's eyes softened, and she smiled. "Ethan, I've always been proud of you, and I'll continue to be proud of everything you accomplish. But don't forget that you don't have to do it all alone." Ethan reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "I don't want to do it alone anymore," he admitted. "I want to share it with you." Maya didn't pull away. Instead, she held his hand a little tighter, her smile widening. "You don't have to do it alone, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with a quiet promise. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt like everything was falling into place. The uncertainty, the fear, the doubt, they all started to fade into the background. He had his own future to create, but now he knew that he didn't have to face it alone. Maya was there for him, and that made all the difference. They stood there for a moment, simply holding each other's gaze, as the weight of the past few months seemed to lift from Ethan's shoulders. He had finally found his path, and now, with Maya by his side, he felt ready to face whatever the future had in store. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, obstacles, and setbacks. But for the first time, Ethan knew that he was no longer walking alone. He was ready to face whatever came next, and with Maya beside him, he was no longer afraid. It had been almost a year since Ethan had made the decision to follow his own path, to step away from the life his father had planned for him. The journey had been one of struggle, growth, and revelation. There were moments of doubt, but with each step, Ethan had found a deeper sense of purpose, and through it all, Maya had been there by his side, supporting him, guiding him, and becoming more than just a mentor. She had become his partner in ways Ethan never imagined. The small business they had started together was thriving, and the future was beginning to look brighter than he had ever expected. It wasn't just about the business anymore. Ethan had found a passion for what he was doing, creating something that mattered, something real. And through that journey, he had learned more about himself than he ever thought possible. But even though he had made peace with his decision, there were still moments when the weight of his father's absence, his father's expectations, hung over him like a shadow. His father had not changed. He still saw Ethan's choice as a mistake, still thought he was throwing away the legacy that had been built for him. Yet, Ethan had stopped seeking his father's approval. He had learned that his true success didn't come from meeting someone else's standards, but from defining his own. One evening, as Ethan and Maya sat together in their office, reviewing the latest project, Ethan found himself thinking about the past year. It had been full of challenges, but it had also been full of moments where he had truly felt alive, when he had taken risks, made mistakes, and kept moving forward. "Maya," Ethan said, his voice breaking through the silence, "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about how far we've come." Maya looked up from her work, meeting his gaze with a soft smile. "And what have you been thinking?" she asked gently. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the weight of everything he had learned in the past year settling on his shoulders. "I used to think that success was about following a certain path," he began, his voice thoughtful. "I thought it was about doing what was expected of me, making everyone proud. But now, I realize that success is about living your truth. It's about doing what you love, even if it scares you." Maya nodded, her expression full of understanding. "That's exactly it, Ethan, and I'm proud of you for figuring that out. So many people go through life never questioning what they've been told to do, but you found your own way." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said softly. "You've been there through it all when I was unsure, when I was scared. You believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Maya's smile softened, her eyes filled with warmth. "You've always had it in you, Ethan," she replied. "You just needed to see it for yourself, and I'll always be here, no matter what comes next." Ethan looked at her, the realization hitting him full force. Over the past year, Maya had become more than just his mentor. She had become his best friend, his partner, someone who had helped him see his own potential. And somewhere along the way, his feelings for her had deepened in a way that he had never fully acknowledged until now. "Maya," he began, his voice a little hesitant, "there's something I need to say." Maya's expression turned serious, and she sat up straighter, sensing the shift in his tone. "What is it, Ethan?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Ethan took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "I don't want to imagine my life without you in it. I've realized that not only have you helped me build this business, but you've helped me build a life I never thought was possible. And he paused, searching for the right words. "I don't want to just keep building things on my own. I want to build a future with you. Not just the business, but everything." Maya's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, she said nothing. Ethan's heart raced, unsure of how she would respond. Then, a soft smile spread across her face, and she stood up, walking over to him. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I've been waiting for you to say that." For a moment, Ethan didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The relief that washed over him was overwhelming. "You mean, you feel the same?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. "I've always felt the same," Maya said, her smile full of affection. "But I wanted you to be sure. I wanted you to realize that what you have your dreams. Your life deserves to be shared with someone who truly cares for you. And that's me." Ethan's heart soared. In that moment, everything fell into place. He had built his own life, his own success, but the most important part of it all was that he wasn't alone anymore. Together, they had created something real, something that mattered. And as they stood there, side by side, Ethan knew that whatever the future held, he was ready to face it with Maya by his side. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more doubts, and more obstacles. But now, with Maya and the lessons he had learned, Ethan knew he was ready for anything, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace. In this captivating story, follow the journey of a young man named Ethan who decides to break free from the expectations of his wealthy father and live life on his own terms. As he faces his deepest fears and doubts, Ethan embarks on a path that leads him to personal growth, self-discovery, and an unexpected bond with Maya, a strong and supportive figure who becomes much more than just a mentor. Together, they create something meaningful, not just in business but in life itself. This story, full of twists, challenges, and moments of introspection, reflects the power of taking control of one's own destiny and finding the courage to embrace the unknown. Along the way, Ethan learns the true meaning of success, which goes beyond wealth and power to encompass personal happiness and fulfillment. Black stories have the unique ability to inspire and move us, showing how overcoming struggles can lead to transformation. As Ethan faces the consequences of his choices, he realizes that the most important things in life are the relationships we build and the integrity we maintain. Maya's role in Ethan's journey proves that true success isn't defined by the world's standards but by our own values. This black story shows that no matter how difficult the path may seem, with the right people by our side, we can create a future that's authentic and true to ourselves. As Ethan's business grows, so does his sense of self-worth, making this a truly inspiring black story that demonstrates resilience, courage, and the strength of following one's heart. The story of Ethan and Maya is not just a tale of success in business, but a journey of self-liberation and mutual support, reminding us that sometimes the best things come when we let go of what holds us back. Ultimately, this black story teaches us that the future is ours to shape, and we should never let anyone define our happiness or dreams.